The bowl of cold soup hit the stone floor, before Alara even saw it coming. It shattered near her bare feet, gray liquid splashing across her ankles, and laughter rose from the long wooden table behind her. "Clean that up, Omega," Lila said, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "You should be grateful I even let you touch our dishes." Alara knelt without a word. She had learned, over 18 years in the Ashwood Pack, that silence was safer than answers. She reached for the shattered pieces of the bowl, careful not to cut her fingers, while the sons and daughters of the betas and elites watched her with the same bored cruelty they always did. This was breakfast. This was every morning. This was her life. She was the weakest wolf the pack had ever produced. That was the story everyone told. The story she had been told so many times that some mornings she almost believed it herself. She could not fully shift. Her wolf lived somewhere inside her, curled tight and silent, refusing to answer her call no matter how hard she tried. Other pups had shifted by the age of 6. Alara was 18, and had never once felt her paws touch the earth. "Look at her hands shaking," Callum said, smirking from his seat at the head of the lower table. He was the alpha's son, broad-shouldered and golden-haired, and he never missed a chance to remind Alara of exactly where she stood in the pack. Even sweeping the floor scares her. "Leave her be," said a quiet voice. Nessa, one of the kitchen workers, knelt down to help gather the broken pottery. She was the only person in Ashwood who ever looked at Alara without contempt, and for that kindness, she was mocked almost as much as Alara herself. "I don't need help," Alara whispered, though she was grateful for it anyway. "You never do," Nessa said gently, "but I'm still going to give it." They finished cleaning in silence, while the pack finished eating around them, the scrape of spoons and low conversation filling the hall. Alara kept her eyes down. She had trained herself to disappear in plain sight, to take up as little space as possible, because the less anyone noticed her, the less they had to laugh about. It had not always been this way. She remembered, faintly, a time before her parents died, when she was small enough to be carried on someone's shoulders, and the world had not yet decided what she was worth. Her mother used to tell her that her blood ran differently than the other pups, that she carried something old and rare, something that would matter one day. Alara used to believe those words were love. Now she understood they were probably just comfort, the kind of thing a mother says to a child who will grow up unwanted. Her parents had been killed in a border skirmish with a rival pack when Alara was 7. After that, there had been no one to defend her, no one to explain why her shift never came, why her strength never grew the way it should have. The pack had simply decided, collectively, and without much discussion, that she was an Omega, the lowest rank a wolf could hold, and that decision had followed her every day since. By mid-morning, Alara was sent to gather firewood at the edge of the territory, a task usually given to the youngest pups, but assigned to her, because no one else wanted to do it. She welcomed it. Out past the training yard, past the rows of small stone houses, the forest opened into quiet, and she could finally breathe, without feeling watched. The trees here were old, their trunks wide enough that 3 wolves could not link paws around them. Alara walked slowly, gathering branches into a bundle, listening to the wind move through the leaves above her. This was the only place in her life that felt like it belonged to her. She had almost finished her bundle when she heard the horses. At first she thought it might be traders passing through, since Ashwood sat near enough to human roads that merchants sometimes cut through packland with permission. But horses did not usually enter through the northern pass, and these hoofbeats were too many, too steady, too disciplined to belong to traders. She crouched low behind a fallen log and watched. A line of riders emerged from the trees, dressed in black and silver, moving with the kind of precision that only trained soldiers carried. At the center of the formation rode a man on a black horse, larger than any Alara had ever seen. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of rank, yet something about the way the others arranged themselves around him, the space they left, the way even the horses seemed to walk more carefully near him, told her exactly who he must be. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Lycan king ruled over every pack on the continent, from the smallest border settlements to the great cities of the western coast. He was said to be the strongest wolf alive, a man who had never lost a challenge, who had taken his throne young and held it through means the stories never fully explained. Some said he had lost his heart in a tragedy so terrible he had sealed away his ability to feel anything at all. Others said He had never had a heart to begin with. Alara had never expected to see him with her own eyes, let alone from behind a fallen log with a bundle of firewood at her feet. She stayed hidden until the riders passed, her heart pounding harder than it had any right to. It was not fear, exactly. It was something else, something she could not name, a strange pull in her chest that made her want to stand up and look at him properly. She resisted it. Whatever business the Lycan king had in Ashwood, it had nothing to do with her. It never would. By the time she returned to the pack grounds, the news had already spread like fire through dry grass. The entire pack was gathering in the central square, whispering, straightening their clothes, fixing their hair. Alpha Garrick stood on the steps of the great hall, his face a careful mixture of pride and barely concealed anxiety, greeting the king's advance guard with all the formality Ashwood could muster on short notice. "The king is here for the trial of bonds," someone near Alara whispered. "He's choosing a mate." Can you imagine? A pack our size? Alara had heard of the trial before, in old stories told by the fire. It was an ancient ritual, older than any pack alive, one that allowed a wolf of noble blood to find their true mate, through a bond that could not be faked, could not be forced, and could not be denied once it appeared. It was said to glow, to hum in the air, to be visible not just to the two wolves involved but to everyone watching. No Lycan king had performed the trial in generations. Most rulers simply chose a mate through politics, through strength, through the ordinary calculations of power. That the king had come to perform it in person, and in a pack as small and unremarkable as Ashwood, sent a ripple of astonishment through everyone gathered. Lila appeared at Alara's side, practically vibrating with excitement. For once she did not seem interested in mocking her. She was too busy imagining herself standing before the king, the bond igniting between them, herself crowned as his queen. "This is our chance," she said to no one in particular, to everyone at once. "This is Ashwood's chance." Alara said nothing. She stood at the very back of the gathering crowd, half hidden behind taller wolves, and watched as the king dismounted his horse. Up close, he was even more striking than the distant glimpse she had caught in the forest. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own power. His expression gave away nothing. He looked over the assembled pack the way a man might look over a field he had already decided not to plant, polite but entirely uninterested. Alpha Garrick bowed low. "Your Majesty, Ashwood is honored beyond words by your presence." "Save the honor for the trial," the king said, his voice low and even. "I've traveled through 6 packs this season, and heard the same speech in each one. I'd rather not hear it a 7th time." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd, though no one seemed entirely sure if he was joking. Garrick's smile faltered only slightly before he recovered it. "Of course, Your Majesty. We will prepare the hall for tomorrow's ceremony." As the king was led toward the great hall, his gaze swept once more over the gathered pack, quick and disinterested, the look of a man counting faces out of habit rather than curiosity. For half a second, Alara thought his eyes paused somewhere near the back of the crowd, near where she stood, but she told herself it was nothing. Kings did not look twice at Omegas. She had learned that lesson many times before, and she had no reason to think tomorrow would be any different. That night, the pack buzzed with plans. Every eligible wolf, and even some who were not quite eligible by strict definition, spent hours preparing. Dresses were mended, hair was braided and rebraided, and Lila in particular seemed to have appointed herself the unofficial future queen of Ashwood already, ordering the younger pups to fetch her ribbons and oils, as though she had already won. Beta Dara found her near the kitchens and informed her, without much interest in her reaction, that she would be serving as an attendant during tomorrow's ceremony, fetching water and refreshments for the guests, keeping to the edges of the hall, and remaining, above all, invisible. "You understand you won't be part of the trial," Dara said. It was not a question. "Omegas don't participate. It wouldn't be appropriate." "I understand," Alara said, because she did. She had understood her place in Ashwood since she was 7 years old. There was no sting left in hearing it stated plainly. Or so she told herself, walking back toward the small room she shared with 2 other Omegas, the noise of the pack's excitement fading behind her like a tide going out. She lay awake that night longer than she meant to, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the pack settle slowly into quiet. Somewhere beneath her ribs, that strange pull from the forest returned, faint but persistent, like a string tied to something she could not see. She pressed a hand flat against her chest, half expecting to feel her heartbeat racing, but it beat steady and calm, as if it knew something she did not. She thought of her mother's old words, something old and rare, something that would matter one day. For 11 years those words had meant nothing except a small, private comfort she allowed herself on the hardest nights. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, she let herself wonder, just barely, whether they might have meant something else entirely. Then she pushed the thought away, because hoping for anything in Ashwood had only ever led to disappointment, and tomorrow, she would be pouring water for a king who would never know her name. Outside her window, the moon rose full and pale over the sleeping pack, and somewhere beyond the training yard, in the guest quarters reserved for visiting royalty, King Draven stood at his own window, unable to explain why he had spent the better part of an hour thinking about a girl he had seen for less than a second in the back of a crowd, a girl whose face he could not fully remember, but whose presence, somehow, he could not seem to forget. He told himself it meant nothing. Tomorrow there would be 100 wolves standing before him, each one hoping the bond would choose them, and he had learned a long time ago not to let stray feelings guide decisions that belonged to fate alone. Whatever this feeling was, he decided, it would pass by morning. It did not. Morning came too fast. Alara woke before dawn, the way she always did, while her two roommates still slept. Mira, an older Omega who had long since given up dreaming of anything better than kitchen work, and Petra, a quiet girl, a year younger than Alara who had been born with a limp, and had learned to survive in Ashwood by making herself useful in ways her body allowed. They had shared this small room for 6 years, and in that time they had become something close to family, though none of them ever said the word out loud. "You're up early," Mira murmured, cracking one eye open. "Big day," Alara said, pulling on her plain gray attendant's dress. "Someone has to carry the water jugs." Mira snorted softly. "Lucky you." Alara smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. She braided her hair quickly, tying it back with a strip of cloth, and slipped out before the sun had fully risen. The kitchens were already alive with activity, cooks preparing trays of food fit for a king's table, servants polishing silverware that had probably not been used in a decade. Alara was handed 2 heavy jugs and told to fill the basins in the great hall before the guests arrived. The hall itself had been transformed overnight. Long banners in the pack's colors hung from the rafters, and the wooden floors had been swept and polished until they gleamed. Chairs lined either side of a long open space where, in a few hours, wolf after wolf would step forward and stand before the king, waiting to see if the ancient bond would recognize them. Alara worked quietly, filling basins, arranging cups, staying out of the way of the beta officials rushing back and forth with instructions. No one spoke to her directly, except to give orders. She had expected nothing else. By mid-morning, the hall began to fill. The pack's most prominent families arrived first, dressed in their finest clothing, followed by the eligible wolves themselves, nervous and glowing with hope. Lila entered last, deliberately, wearing a deep blue dress that had clearly taken half the night to prepare, her chin lifted, with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this day would end. Alara watched from the edge of the room, a water jug balanced against her hip, as the king entered through the far doors. He wore black again, simple but clearly expensive, a single silver chain at his throat, the only hint of his rank. He walked to the front of the hall and took his place without ceremony, his expression unreadable, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. "Let us begin," Alpha Garrick announced, his voice carrying false confidence into the silence. Alara adjusted her grip on the jug and tried to make herself as small as possible against the wall. Whatever happened in this hall today, she told herself, it had nothing to do with her. She was here to pour water, nothing more. She repeated that thought to herself like a small, steady prayer, and did her best to believe it. The first wolf to step forward was a beta named Corwin, tall and eager, his eyes shining with hope as he approached the king. He bowed low, then straightened, waiting. The king studied him for a long moment, his expression unchanged, and then shook his head once. Corwin's face fell, and he retreated to his seat while murmurs rippled through the hall. One by one, the pack's eligible wolves stepped forward. Each approached with the same nervous hope, and each was met with the same quiet dismissal. There was no anger in the king's rejections, no cruelty, only a kind of tired patience, as though he had performed this exact scene in 5 other packs already, and expected nothing different here. Lila stepped forward when her name was called, and the entire hall seemed to lean in. She moved with practiced grace, her chin high, and stopped directly in front of the king, with a confidence that bordered on certainty. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the king's eyes flickered, not with recognition, but with mild curiosity, as if he were waiting for something that refused to arrive. Silence stretched. Lila's smile began to falter. "No," the king said quietly. The word landed like a slap. Lila's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, humiliation, and finally, a carefully controlled mask of composure as she returned to her seat, refusing to look at anyone. Alpha Garrick's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Elara, watching from the wall, felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for Lila, though she quickly reminded herself of every cruel word Lila had ever thrown her way. Sympathy, she decided, was wasted on people who had never once offered her the same. Callum went next, presented not as a mate, but as a show of the pack's strength, standing tall and confident, though the trial of bonds was known to occasionally reveal unexpected pairings, regardless of gender or rank. The king barely looked at him before shaking his head again. By the time the last of the pack's prepared candidates had been presented and dismissed, a restless unease had settled over the hall. Alpha Garrick stepped forward, sweat visible at his temples despite the cool morning air. "Your Majesty, I apologize. We have presented every eligible member of our pack." "Every eligible member," the king repeated, his tone flat. His gray eyes swept slowly across the room, pausing here and there, as though searching for something the crowd itself was hiding from him. "Strange. I could have sworn there were more wolves in this pack than I've been shown today." A nervous silence followed. Garrick glanced toward his advisors, clearly uncertain how to respond. It was Beta Dara who finally spoke, her voice careful. "Your Majesty, we have Omegas among us as well, but it is not customary for them to participate in the trial." "Customary," the king said, as though tasting the word and finding it distasteful. "I did not travel 6 packs and countless miles to hear about your customs. I came to find a bond. If there is even one wolf in this hall who has not stood before me, I want them brought forward." A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain and uneasy. Elara felt her stomach drop. She kept her eyes fixed on the water jug in her hands, willing herself invisible, praying that whatever strange curiosity had gripped the king would pass before anyone thought to look her way. It did not pass. "There," the king said, and though his voice was quiet, it seemed to fill the entire hall. "The girl by the wall, bring her forward." Every head in the room turned. Elara felt the weight of 100 stares land on her at once, felt her face flood with heat, felt the jug tremble slightly in her grip before she set it down with as much composure as she could manage. Beta Dara's expression flickered between confusion and alarm. "Your Majesty, she is only an attendant, she is not." "I did not ask what she is," the king said, his gray eyes fixed now, unmistakably, on Elara. "I asked her to come forward." There was nowhere to hide, and no version of this moment that ended without her walking the length of that long, polished floor, while the entire pack that had spent 18 years telling her she was worthless watched her do it. Elara swallowed hard, straightened her spine the way her mother had once shown her, long ago, before everything had changed, and stepped away from the wall. The walk felt endless. She was aware of every eye tracking her movement, aware of Lila's furious, humiliated stare, aware of Callum's smirk faltering into something closer to confusion, aware of Nessa near the back of the hall pressing a hand to her mouth. Elara kept walking, one bare foot in front of the other across the cold stone floor, until she stood at last before the king of every pack on the continent, close enough now to see that his storm-gray eyes were not cold at all, but searching, intent, and impossibly focused on her alone. "Name," he said, quieter now than he had spoken to anyone else all morning. "Elara," she said, and was surprised her voice did not shake. The king studied her for a long moment, silence stretching taut across the hall, and Elara braced herself for the same dismissal every other wolf had received. the same quiet no that would let her retreat back to her jug and her invisibility and her small, safe corner of the world. That dismissal never came. Instead, the king reached out and took her hand. The moment his fingers closed around hers, the world seemed to tilt. A warmth spread from her palm up through her arm, gentle at first, then blooming into something bright and undeniable. A golden light that curled around their joined hands like living thread. Gasps rippled through the hall. Ilara stared down at the glow surrounding their fingers, certain for a moment that she was dreaming, that she would wake any second back in the small room she shared with Mira and Petra, back in the life where she was nothing. But the light did not fade. It grew brighter, wrapping higher, climbing toward their wrists, humming faintly in the air like a note held too long to be natural. The bond. The ancient, unmistakable bond that could not be faked, could not be forced, and could not be denied once it appeared. King Draven's expression had shifted from careful composure into something raw and unguarded, something none of the pack had ever seen on the face of the Lycan king. He looked at Ilara, as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, past the plain gray dress and the calloused hands and the years of quiet suffering etched into the set of her shoulders. "It's you," he said softly, almost to himself. Ilara could not speak. Her mind raced through 18 years of ridicule, 18 years of being told she was the weakest wolf the pack had ever known, and none of it made sense against the golden light still glowing warm between their joined hands. This could not be real, and yet it was. Around them, the hall had fallen into a silence so complete that Ilara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Lila's sharp intake of breath, could hear Alpha Garrick's stunned whisper to Beta Dara, asking how this was possible, how the weak Omega could possibly be the one. King Draven released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to let go even for a moment, and then, in front of the entire pack, in front of every wolf who had ever laughed at her, mocked her, thrown scraps at her feet, he lowered himself to one knee. The sound that went through the hall was not quite a gasp and not quite a cry. It was disbelief given voice. 100 people struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had believed to be true just moments before. A king did not kneel. A king, least of all this king, feared and legendary and untouchable, did not kneel before anyone, let alone an Omega dismissed as worthless by her own pack. But he knelt before Ilara, his head bowed, his hand still loosely holding hers, and the golden light of the bond glowed steady and unbroken between them. "I have searched every pack on this continent for 11 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, meant for her though everyone could hear it. I had begun to believe the bond would never find me. I was wrong. Ilara looked down at him, at the most powerful wolf in the world kneeling at her feet, and felt something crack open inside her chest, some old, tired wall she had built brick by brick over 18 years of being told she did not matter. Tears she had not given herself permission to cry in years blurred her vision, and she did not bother stopping them. Somewhere behind her, she heard Lila's chair scrape back violently as she fled the hall, and she heard Callum's voice, low and stunned, muttering something no one else caught. She heard none of it clearly, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was the warmth of the king's hand still wrapped around hers, and the impossible, undeniable truth that the bond had chosen her. Alpha Garrick was the first to recover his voice. He stepped forward, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. "Your Majesty, forgive us. We had no idea. If we had known she carried such a bond, we would have—" "You would have what?" Draven asked, rising to his feet at last, though he kept Ilara's hand held gently in his own. His voice had returned to its usual coldness, but now it was aimed squarely at the Alpha rather than at her. "Treated her with basic decency, fed her properly, allowed her a place at your table instead of forcing her to eat scraps from the floor?" Garrick's face paled. "Your Majesty, I assure you." "I have eyes, Alpha Garrick," Draven said. "I saw the state of her hands the moment I took hold of them. I saw the way she flinched when I called her forward, as though she expected to be struck for stepping out of line. I do not need your assurances. I have seen quite enough." The hall had gone utterly silent again. Every wolf who had once mocked Ilara now staring at their own feet, unwilling to meet the king's gaze, or Ilara's own. She stood frozen at the center of it all, still trying to understand how a morning that began with her filling water basins had ended with her standing hand in hand with the most powerful man on the continent, the bond of a lifetime glowing faintly between them. "I don't understand," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Why me?" Draven turned to look at her, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, something like gentleness crossed his features. "The bond does not choose by rank, or by strength, or by the opinions of a pack too blind to recognize what it had," he said. "It chooses by something deeper, something even I do not fully understand. But I have felt this pull since the moment I glimpsed you in the forest yesterday, and I have learned, over many years, not to question what the bond decides." Ilara's breath caught. He had seen her in the forest. She had thought herself hidden, unnoticed, and yet somehow he had known, or felt, or sensed something even then. "What happens now?" she asked, because it was easier than trying to process everything else swirling through her mind. "Now," Draven said, "you come with me, as is proper for any wolf found through the trial of bonds, regardless of the rank they were assigned by lesser judgment." His eyes flicked briefly, pointedly, toward Alpha Garrick as he said the last words, and the Alpha visibly winced. The hall erupted into a low, disbelieving murmur as the reality of the moment settled over the pack. The Omega they had spent 18 years despising was leaving with the king, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, but as his bonded mate, his equal by the oldest law their kind possessed. Ilara looked past Draven, toward the back of the hall, and found Nessa's face among the crowd, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, mouth open in a mixture of shock and joy. It was the only face in that entire room looking at her with anything close to happiness, and Ilara held on to that image as tightly as she could, because everything else happening around her felt too large, too impossible, too far beyond anything she had ever allowed herself to hope for. She did not look at Lila. She did not look at Callum. She kept her eyes on Nessa, and on the warm, steady hand still holding her own, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that her mother's old words had been true after all. Something old and rare, something that would matter one day. Today, it seemed, had finally arrived. She was given only an hour to gather her belongings, though in truth there was little to gather: a worn blanket, a hair ribbon that had once belonged to her mother, a small carved wolf her father had made for her before he died. Everything else in that small room belonged to Ashwood, not to her, and she left it without a second glance. Mira and Petra helped her fold the few things she owned into a cloth bag, both of them still stunned into a kind of dazed silence. "I always knew there was something different about you," Mira said finally, shaking her head. "I just never imagined it was this." "I didn't either," Ilara admitted. Petra hugged her tightly, her thin arms surprisingly strong. "Don't forget us," she whispered. "Never," Ilara promised, and meant it with her whole heart. Nessa found her just as she was leaving the small house, breathless from running across the pack grounds. She pulled Ilara into a fierce embrace, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "You deserve this," Nessa finally said, pulling back to look at her. "You deserve every good thing that happens to you from this day forward. Don't let anyone in that castle make you forget that either." "I won't," Ilara said, though privately, she wondered how she could possibly hold on to such a promise, in a world so far beyond anything she had ever known. The king's convoy left Ashwood before the sun reached its highest point, Ilara riding in a carriage more comfortable than any bed she had ever slept in, watching through the small window as the pack that had raised her, and mocked her, and nearly broken her, shrank into the distance behind them. She felt no sadness at leaving it. If anything, she felt only the strange, unfamiliar lightness of a weight finally set down. Draven rode beside the carriage for most of the journey, rather than ahead with his guard, and though he said little, his presence outside her window felt oddly steadying. Late in the afternoon, when the convoy stopped to rest the horses, he came to sit across from her inside the carriage for the first time. "You've been quiet," he observed. "I have a lot to think about," Ilara said honestly. "That's fair." He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes less guarded now than they had been in the hall. "I imagine this is a great deal to take in, all at once. A new pack, a new title, a mate you'd never met until this morning." "That's one way to put it," Ilara said, and was surprised to find a small, genuine smile tugging at her mouth. Something in Draven's expression eased at the sight of it, a subtle softening around his eyes that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to witness. "I meant what I said in the hall," he told her. "I've searched for you a long time, longer than you probably realize. I won't pretend the road ahead will be simple. My court is not always a kind place, and there will be those who resent what happened today. But I intend to make certain you are never again treated as anything less than what you are." "And what is that?" Ilara asked quietly. "What am I, exactly? Because Ashwood spent 18 years telling me I was nothing, and I still don't understand how that could have been so wrong." Draven considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't fully know yet," he admitted. "But I intend to find out, and I suspect, when we do, it will surprise us both." Ilara looked out the window again, at the unfamiliar countryside rolling past, green hills giving way to distant mountains she had never seen before, and let herself, cautiously, begin to hope. The castle of the Lycan king rose out of the mountains like something carved by nature rather than built by hands, dark stone towers wrapped in mist, banners bearing the royal crest snapping in the wind high above. Ilara had never imagined a place so vast. As the carriage rolled through the outer gates, she pressed her palm against the window glass, trying to take in the scale of it. Courtyards larger than the entire Ashwood pack grounds, guards in polished armor standing at every entrance, a city sprawling below the castle walls that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "It takes some getting used to," Draven said, watching her reaction with quiet amusement. "I don't think I'll ever get used to this," Ilara admitted. They were greeted at the main entrance by a small gathering of the king's inner circle. Faces Ilara did not recognize, expressions ranging from polite curiosity to something far less welcoming. A tall woman, with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper gaze, stepped forward first, dressed in deep burgundy robes that marked her as someone of considerable rank. "Your Majesty," the woman said, bowing precisely. "Welcome home. I trust the trial was successful, given your early return." "It was," Draven said simply. "Ilara, this is Sabine, head of my council. Sabine, this is Ilara, my bonded mate." If Sabine was surprised, she hid it well, though her eyes swept over Ilara's plain traveling clothes, with a coolness that needed no words to convey judgment. "How wonderful," she said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "A pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," Ilara said, holding the woman's gaze steadily, despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. She had faced down years of ridicule in Ashwood. She refused to let one unimpressed noblewoman unsettle her on her very first afternoon in a new home. Sabine's mouth twitched, whether in approval or irritation Ilara could not tell, before she turned back to Draven with a stack of papers in hand. "The border reports from the Eastern Territories arrived this morning, Your Majesty. There have been further incidents near the Thorn Hollow line. I believe it warrants your attention."
"After I've seen Ilara settled," Draven said firmly.
"Of course," Sabine said, though something flickered behind her eyes, quick and calculating, gone before Ilara could name it. Ilara was led through the castle by a kind older servant named Wren, who showed her to a suite of rooms larger than the entire house she had shared with Mira and Petra. There was a bed piled high with soft blankets, a wardrobe already stocked with clothing far finer than anything Ilara had ever worn, and a window overlooking gardens so beautifully kept that Ilara stood at the glass for several long minutes, simply staring. "It's a lot to take in, I imagine," Wren said kindly, setting down a tray of tea and warm bread. "Most bonded mates feel overwhelmed the first few days. It does get easier." "Thank you," Ilara said, and meant it deeply. It was the first ordinary kindness anyone besides Draven had shown her since she arrived, and she found herself blinking back unexpected tears at the simple gesture. That evening, Draven found her still awake, curled in the window seat, overlooking the darkened gardens, watching moonlight ripple across a distant fountain. He knocked softly at the open door before entering. "May I?" Ilara nodded, and he crossed the room to sit across from her, close but careful to leave space, as though respecting a boundary she had not needed to ask for. "Sabine doesn't like me," Ilara said, before she could stop herself. "Sabine doesn't like anyone, at first," Draven said. "She's spent 30 years protecting this court from every manner of threat, real and imagined. She'll come around, in time, once she understands you're not a threat to anything she's built here." And if she doesn't? Draven's expression grew more serious. Then she'll answer to me. You are not a temporary guest in this castle, Ilara. You are its future queen. Whether my council finds that comfortable or not, that is not something I intend to apologize for, to Sabine or to anyone else. Ilara looked down at her hands, still faintly calloused from years of labor Ashwood had assigned her without complaint. It's strange, she said quietly. This morning I was pouring water for a room full of people who thought I was worthless. Tonight you're telling me I'm going to be a queen. I don't know how to hold both of those things at once. You don't have to hold them at once, Draven said gently. You only have to hold today. Tomorrow will bring its own weight, and I intend to help you carry it, whatever it turns out to be. For the first time since the water jug had fallen from her hands in that stunned, silent hall, Ilara allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that perhaps tomorrow would not hurt the way every day before it had. She was wrong to think the road ahead would be easy. But that night, watching moonlight ripple across an unfamiliar garden beside a king who had knelt before her in front of an entire pack that once called her worthless, she let herself rest in the quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Ilara could hardly have imagined a month earlier. Mornings began with lessons, court etiquette taught by a patient instructor named Halden, history of the packs delivered by an elderly scholar who seemed delighted to finally have a student willing to listen. Afternoons were spent walking the castle gardens with Draven when his duties allowed, learning the shape of her new life one careful step at a time. Not everyone in the castle welcomed her so warmly. Sabine remained coolly polite, her sharp eyes tracking Ilara's every move during council meetings, as though waiting for her to reveal some hidden flaw that would justify her lingering doubts. Whispers followed Ilara through the halls, quiet enough to pretend she had not heard them, questioning how an Omega, with no shift, no strength, and no lineage, anyone recognized, could possibly be fit to stand beside the Lycan king. Ilara tried not to let the whispers wound her the way similar words once had in Ashwood. She reminded herself, on the harder days, that she had survived 18 years of far crueler treatment, with far less kindness surrounding her. A few doubtful glances from strangers in a castle could not undo that resilience now. Still, the whispers grew louder as the weeks passed, fed by something Ilara could not quite name, until the evening Sabine requested a private audience with the king, one that Ilara was not invited to attend, though she happened to be passing the council chamber when raised voices carried through the heavy wooden doors. Cannot simply overlook her origins, Your Majesty, Sabine was saying, her voice tight with barely restrained frustration. An Omega with no known bloodline, no recorded ancestry beyond 2 low-ranking parents killed in a border skirmish. The bond may be real. I do not dispute what I witnessed in that hall. But bonds have been manipulated before, through old magic. Dark practices your father spent decades trying to root out. Careful, Sabine. Draven's voice cut through, low and dangerous in a way Ilara had not yet heard him use. You are speaking of my mate. I am speaking of the safety of your throne, Sabine shot back. If word spreads that the bond was forced through some manner of spellwork, real or fabricated, it will be enough for your enemies to challenge your rule. You know this as well as I do. Ilara did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly back down the corridor, her chest tight, her mind spinning through Sabine's words. Dark magic, manipulated bonds. She had never once considered that anyone might question whether the bond between her and Draven was real, that anyone might use her humble origins as a weapon against the man who had knelt before her in front of an entire pack. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself wandering toward the castle's small library, drawn by some restless need to understand more about the bloodline Sabine seemed so certain she did not possess. The old scholar who taught her history had once mentioned records of ancient wolf lines, families whose blood carried gifts long thought extinct. Perhaps, Ilara thought, there was some answer buried in those dusty shelves that could explain the strange pull she had felt even before meeting Draven, the flicker of something unfamiliar that occasionally stirred beneath her skin since arriving at the castle. She had barely begun searching the shelves when she heard footsteps behind her. Can't sleep either? Draven asked, stepping into the dim lamplight. I heard you and Sabine earlier, Ilara admitted, deciding honesty was easier than pretending otherwise. I wasn't trying to listen, I just happened to be walking past. Draven's expression tightened briefly, before easing into something more careful. Sabine worries. It's her role to worry, and most days I'm grateful for it. But she is wrong about you, Alara, and I intend to prove it, to her and to anyone else who doubts what I already know to be true. How can you be so certain? Alara asked. Even I don't know where this pull comes from. I don't know why my shift never came in Ashwood, or why sometimes now, I feel something moving under my skin that I can't explain. What if Sabine is right to worry? Draven crossed the library and took both her hands gently in his own, the same warmth she remembered from the hall in Ashwood settling quiet and steady between them. Then we find the truth together, he said. Whatever it is, I am not afraid of what you might turn out to be, Alara. I have only ever been afraid of a life without you in it, and I only just found you. I don't intend to let old fears take that away. Alara held his gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet library wrapped around them like a held breath. Whatever answers waited in her past, whatever truth Sabine feared or hoped to uncover, Alara realized she no longer faced it as the frightened Omega who had once knelt on a cold stone floor, gathering broken pottery. She faced it as someone who, for the first time in her life, had someone standing firmly beside her. That certainty would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The trouble at Thornhollow, Alara soon learned, was more serious than a few border disputes. A rival faction calling themselves the Ashen Claw had been steadily gathering strength along the eastern edge of Draven's territory for months, exploiting old grievances from packs who felt overlooked by the crown, promising power and freedom to any wolf willing to join their cause. Draven had kept the worst of the reports quiet, unwilling to alarm a court already unsettled by his sudden, unconventional choice of mate. But Alara overheard enough during council sessions she was now permitted to attend, to understand the danger was growing, rather than fading. They grow bolder, Sabine reported one afternoon, spreading a map across the council table, her finger tracing the eastern border where several small red marks indicated recent skirmishes. 3 border patrols attacked in the last fortnight alone. Whoever leads them understands our territory well enough to strike where we're weakest. Someone within our own ranks feeding them information, one of the generals suggested grimly. Or someone testing how the crown responds to instability, Draven said, his jaw tight. Either way, we cannot ignore it much longer. Alara sat quietly at the edge of the council table, absorbing every word, feeling for the first time the true weight of what it meant to stand beside a king. This was not simply a matter of dresses and etiquette lessons and cautious court politics. Somewhere beyond these castle walls, real danger gathered, and the man she had bonded with only weeks earlier would be expected to meet it head-on. She did not have to wait long to understand exactly how close that danger could come. It happened on a quiet evening, nearly 2 months after her arrival, during a small gathering meant to formally introduce Alara to the wider court. She had grown more comfortable in the castle by then, more confident in her place beside Draven despite Sabine's lingering coolness, and the evening had passed pleasantly enough until the moment the lights along the eastern hall flickered and died all at once. Shouts rose from the courtyard below. Guards scrambled through the corridors, and Draven's expression shifted instantly from calm host to something harder, sharper, unmistakably a king preparing for battle. "Stay behind me," he told Alara, already moving toward the source of the commotion. She did not listen, not entirely. She followed close behind as he moved through the darkened halls, her heart pounding, some instinct she could not name pulling her forward rather than back. When they reached the courtyard, 3 cloaked figures were already engaged with the castle guard, moving with a speed and coordination that spoke of serious training rather than desperate opportunism. One of the figures broke free of the fighting and turned directly toward Alara, blade raised, moving faster than she could process. What happened next occurred in less time than it took to draw a single breath. A warmth exploded outward from somewhere deep inside her chest, sudden and fierce, and before the blade could reach her, a shimmering barrier of golden light flared into existence between them, throwing the attacker backward with enough force to send him sprawling across the stone courtyard. The fighting stopped. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward Alara, standing frozen with her hands raised, faint golden light still fading from her fingertips, her own breath coming in, shocked, ragged gasps. "What?" Sabine said slowly, emerging from the chaos with her own blade drawn, staring at Alara with an expression that had shifted entirely from suspicion into something closer to astonishment. Was that? Alara had no answer. She looked down at her own trembling hands, then up at Draven, whose expression held none of Sabine's shock, only a slow, dawning certainty, as though something he had long suspected had finally, undeniably, revealed itself. "I think," he said quietly, "we've found our answer." The attackers were captured before dawn, their wounds tended just enough to allow questioning, and what they revealed sent a fresh wave of unease through the castle. They had been sent by the Ashen Claw specifically to remove Alara, believing, correctly as it turned out, that an unbonded king would be far easier to challenge for the throne than one anchored by a true mate bond. Someone within the Ashen Claw's leadership had clearly done their research, understanding the old laws well enough to know that removing Alara before the bond could be formally recognized by the wider packs might be enough to throw the entire succession into chaos. What none of them had accounted for was the golden light that had thrown their assassin halfway across the courtyard. "I need answers," Draven said the next morning, gathering his most trusted scholars, along with Sabine and the castle's oldest historian, a frail but sharp-eyed woman named Adeline, who had served 3 generations of the royal family. Alara sat beside him, still shaken from the previous night, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not yet managed to drink. Adeline studied Alara for a long moment before speaking, her pale eyes narrowed in concentration. "Tell me about your mother," she said finally. "What do you remember of her?" Alara thought back, carefully, to fragments she had carried for 11 years. "She used to tell me my blood ran differently than the other pups, that I carried something old and rare. I always thought she meant it as comfort, nothing more." Adeline's expression sharpened with sudden recognition. "What was her name?" "Ren," Alara said, then paused. "No, that's not right. That's the servant here. My mother's name was Win." The old historian's breath caught audibly. She rose from her chair with more speed than her frail frame seemed capable of, and disappeared briefly into the library's oldest archive, returning several minutes later with a heavy, dust-covered volume bound in cracked leather. "The Wardens of Light," she said, setting the book carefully on the table, and turning to a page depicting an old family crest, a wolf wreathed in golden flame. An ancient bloodline, thought extinct for nearly 2 centuries. They served the very first Lycan rulers as protectors, gifted with abilities tied directly to the bond itself, capable of shielding their king and queen from harm through pure will alone. Their line was believed wiped out during the wars that followed the fall of the Old Kingdom. "Believed," Draven repeated quietly. "Clearly not entirely accurate," Adeline said, glancing at Alara with something between wonder and disbelief. "If your mother's name was Win, and if she came from a lineage that carried this gift dormant through generations, it would explain everything. Why your shift never fully manifested in the ordinary way. The Warden's power does not always announce itself early, particularly not without a bond to awaken it fully. It sleeps, sometimes for an entire lifetime, until it's needed." Sabine, who had remained silent through the entire explanation, finally spoke, her voice quieter and far less guarded than Alara had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology," she said, meeting Alara's eyes directly. "I suspected weakness where there was only power waiting to be understood. That was a poor judgment on my part, and I regret it." "Thank you," Alara said, and found she meant it, the last of her lingering wariness toward the sharp-eyed councilwoman finally easing. Draven reached over and took Alara's hand, the same warmth from that first day in Ashwood settling between them once more, though it felt different now, layered with understanding rather than mystery. "You were never weak," he said quietly. "Ashwood simply never had the knowledge to recognize what stood in front of them." Alara looked down at the ancient crest in the old book, a wolf wreathed in golden flame, and felt something settle deep inside her chest, a truth finally arriving after 18 years of believing the opposite. She had spent her whole life being told she was the least of her pack. She had never once imagined she descended from the very protectors the first kings of her kind had relied upon to survive. Her mother had been right after all. In the weeks that followed, Alara trained under Adeline's careful guidance, learning to call the golden light forward on purpose, rather than waiting for fear or danger to summon it involuntarily. It was slow, difficult work. The power did not respond to force or frustration, only to calm, steady focus, something Alara found came more naturally to her than she expected. perhaps because she had spent so many years learning to remain calm under far crueler pressure than any training exercise could provide. Draven watched her progress with quiet pride, often joining her sessions in the training yard when his duties allowed, and slowly, steadily, the bond between them deepened beyond the golden light that had first revealed it. Alara found herself laughing more easily in his presence, found herself seeking him out not from obligation, but from genuine desire for his company, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that the careful, guarded king everyone in the castle feared had become, in private moments, remarkably gentle with her. The Ashen Claw did not remain quiet for long. Word reached the castle that they had grown bold enough to mass an actual force along the eastern border, no longer content with small skirmishes and failed assassination attempts. Their leader, a former beta named Vayne who had once been exiled from his own pack for cruelty toward those weaker than himself, had apparently decided the failed attack on Alara meant only that a larger show of force was required. "He wants a battle," Draven said grimly, studying the report spread across the council table. "He believes numbers alone will be enough to shake the throne." "Let him believe that," Alara said, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "We'll show him otherwise." The battle that followed, when it came, was unlike anything Alara had ever imagined facing. The eastern fields beyond Thornhollow, filled with wolves from both sides, the Ashen Claw's ragged, desperate force clashing against the disciplined lines of the Royal Guard. Alara rode beside Draven, not as a helpless bystander, but as a protector in her own right. The golden light she had spent weeks learning to summon, now flaring readily beneath her palms, whenever danger drew close. She used it to shield injured guards from further harm, to throw back attackers who came too near the king, to hold steady a line that might otherwise have broken under the weight of Vayne's numbers. It was exhausting, unlike anything her body had ever been asked to do, but for the first time in her life, exhaustion came paired with purpose rather than despair. Vayne himself sought out Draven directly as the battle wore on, cutting through the chaos with single-minded determination, clearly believing that removing the king himself would end the conflict in his favor. Draven met him blade for blade, the fight brutal and fast, until a misstep sent Draven stumbling, Vayne's blade rising for a blow that would have ended everything. Alara did not think. She moved on instinct alone, throwing herself between them, golden light exploding outward with a force greater than anything she had summoned before, catching Vayne's blade and hurling him backward across the field, with enough power to end the fight entirely. He did not rise again. Silence fell across the battlefield as the remaining Ashen Claw fighters, leaderless and stunned by what they had witnessed, began to lay down their weapons one by one. Draven pulled himself upright, breathing hard, and turned to find Alara still standing protectively in front of him, golden light fading slowly from her hands, her chest heaving with effort. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her tightly while the last echoes of battle faded around them. "You saved my life," he said quietly against her hair. "You knelt before me in front of an entire pack that told me I was worthless," Alara said, her voice trembling now that the danger had finally passed. "I think we're even." Draven laughed, low and warm, the sound of a man who had spent most of his life guarded against joy, finally allowing himself to feel it fully. "I don't think we'll ever be even," he said, "but I intend to spend a very long life trying." News of the battle at Thornhollow spread quickly across every pack on the continent, and with it spread the story of the Omega who had once been mocked in Ashwood, who now stood as a warden of light beside the Lycan king, who had turned back an entire rebellion with nothing but the ancient power sleeping in her blood. Alara found the attention strange at first, uncomfortable even, after a lifetime spent trying to remain invisible. But slowly, she allowed herself to accept it, to stand a little taller when strangers bowed in the castle halls, to answer questions about her past honestly, rather than with the practiced silence she had once relied upon for survival. Months later, when the castle had settled back into its ordinary rhythms, and the last of the Ashen Claw's scattered remnants had either surrendered or fled beyond the borders entirely, Draven suggested a visit to Ashwood, a formal one, with Alara at his side, not as the attendant who once poured water in a corner, but as his queen, in all but the final ceremony still to come. Alara considered the idea carefully before agreeing. Part of her worried the visit would reopen old wounds better left closed, but another part of her, The part that had spent 18 years swallowing every unkind word without ever being allowed to answer back, wanted very much to walk through those gates again, this time on her own terms. Ashwood had not changed much in her absence. The same stone houses, the same training yard, the same great hall where she had once knelt to gather broken pottery, while Lila laughed above her. What had changed was the way the pack looked at her now, arriving in a carriage bearing the royal crest, dressed not in a plain grey attendant's uniform but in clothing befitting the queen she was soon to become. Alpha Garrick greeted them with visible nerves, his bow deeper and more careful than the one he had offered Draven on his first visit. Beta Dara stood beside him, unable to quite meet Alara's eyes. Lila was nowhere to be seen, though Alara heard later, without much surprise, that she had left Ashwood shortly after the trial, unable to bear remaining in a pack that now told her story as a cautionary tale about misjudging those deemed weak. It was Nessa who ran forward first, ignoring all formality, pulling Alara into a tight embrace the moment she stepped from the carriage. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely. "I always knew there was more to you than they let themselves see." "Thank you for never treating me like they did," Alara whispered back. "I never forgot that kindness." Before they left, Alara asked to speak privately with the pack, gathered once more in the same hall where everything had changed for her months earlier. She stood at the front of the room, not as an attendant this time, and looked out over faces she had once feared, faces that now watched her with a mixture of shame and quiet respect. "I spent 18 years being told I was the weakest wolf this pack had ever produced," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I believed it, most days, because it was easier than hoping for anything different. I'm not here today to seek revenge for that, or to demand apologies I know some of you aren't ready to give. I'm here because I want you to understand something simple. Strength doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like an omega pouring water in the corner of a room, waiting for the world to notice what she's capable of, long after everyone else stopped looking." No one spoke. Alara did not need them to. She had said what she came to say, and as she turned to leave the hall, Draven's hand found hers, warm and steady, exactly as it had been since the moment the bond first revealed itself between them. Her coronation took place beneath a bright autumn sky several weeks later, the castle courtyard filled with representatives from every pack on the continent, including, to Alara's quiet satisfaction, a small delegation from Ashwood standing among the crowd. Adeline placed the crown upon her head with careful, ceremonial hands, and Sabine, once her fiercest doubter, now stood among her most loyal supporters, watching with an expression of genuine pride. Draven took her hand as the crowd erupted into cheers, the same golden warmth flowing between them that had first ignited in a small pack hall so many months earlier, undeniable and unbroken, exactly as it had always been meant to be. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear. Alara looked out over the crowd, over the faces of people who had once overlooked her entirely, and now called her queen, and felt the last remnants of the frightened, invisible girl she had once been settle quietly into peace. "None," she said, "not one." And as the sun set golden over the mountains that evening, casting long light across a kingdom that had finally recognized what Ashwood had spent 18 years refusing to see, Alara understood at last that her mother had been right all along. She had always carried something old and rare within her. It had simply taken the right person, and the right moment, for the whole world to finally notice.